Anyway, go ahead. What was your...
I wanted to ask you two questions about things that came up on other Arcadian Vanguard shows, ones that are not released yet but will be in the next few weeks. But Mid-South Wrestling, November of 83, a dark, dark period of time for Mid-South. Some of those shows, there's one episode, again, if you listen to the Mid-South Television review podcast with me and Mike Mills, you'll hear this in a few weeks. It's Jim Ross, who's not yet Jim Ross, and he gets nervous on the air, and Buddy Nichols from Alexandria, Louisiana. Did you ever run into Buddy Nichols?
I'm trying to...
The sports director from the TV station in Alexandria.
Yes, that's okay. I think he came to the matches once or whatever. I remembered the name from living in Alexandria and probably seeing it on TV. Go ahead.
Well, really rough, because when you have matches that aren't the greatest on TV and you don't even have Bill Watts to talk about geopolitics and so different issues with society, it's not
just anything to cover up for its, Josh Stroud against fucking Ricky Ferrara.
Josh Stroud, that's right. So at the end, actually one of the matches was Hacksaw Higgins, or Larry Higgins versus Art Cruz. That was one of the matches on TV in November.
Art Cruz was prematurely gray when he was in his 20s.
Yeah, he looks a lot older than he was there. So on the show, though, at the very end, Jim Ross is about to interview the Road Warriors because they were still trying to figure out what they were going to do at Mid-South. You could tell the talks with Jarrett had happened, but Bill wasn't still sure about the direction, where they were going to go, because they were teasing more with the Road Warriors that wouldn't happen. But one of the things that is said is at the end of the show, Jim Ross says, next week, Steve Dr. Death Williams returns and the debut of Dennis Condrey. Which made me think, oh, that's interesting. That means, even though the Midnight Express were put together for Mid-South Wrestling, at that point in time, Bill Watts already had Condrey on the radar, but not necessarily you and Bobby Eaton.
Now, what was the date of this?
Hold on, I have it right here. I have my notes.
Because this is something I've never heard. I've never heard that.
It was the episode that aired November 19th, 1983. It was taped November 9th, 1983.
Okay, 2 weeks later was November 23rd. That was the night before Thanksgiving, and that was our first night there at Shreveport to do the first tapings as the Midnight Express. So, yes, 2 weeks beforehand, and as a matter of fact, I could find the exact date, but I'm thinking it was the last of October. The Watts came to the Mid-South Coliseum to look at guys. But like you said, they still hadn't figured out exactly what they wanted to do. And when you say the dark period of Mid-South, and a lot of people, younger fans and who didn't watch every week, and obviously everything on a weekly basis was not available on the network and et cetera, so you had to live it or get the videos later. But it was a situation where Ernie Ladd had been booking, and he was kind of burnt out. And the talent was not the best, and there wasn't an energy to the program and to the shows, and there were talented guys there, but they weren't in the right combinations, and the whole thing just needed a spark. And it was like that for the last maybe 4, 5, 6 months of 83, and it got really, when business got bad.
Well, October, November, it is apparent. I mean, real quick, here are the last two episodes that we just recorded. So November 12th, 1983, you get a bunch of recaps. The matches in the Irish McGill Boys Club. The Mid-South Tag Team Champions Butch Reed and Jim Neidhart versus George Weingroff and Randy Barber. Nikolai Volkov versus Crusher Darso. Nikolai getting a big push at this period of time.
And Darso would later on become a Russian sympathizer and join Nikolai. Yes.
But right now he was still in Daisy Dukes.
Yeah,
he was a friendly lumberjack.
The friendly lumberjack Crusher Darso.
Road Warriors versus Mike Bond and Art Cruz. Mr. Wrestling 2 versus Paul Garner, the gangliest looking job guy I've ever seen.
Yeah, these were all Mike Jackson's guys from Alabama.
Jeff Sword versus Mike Jackson.
Well, there you go.
And Tony Torres versus John King. So
that was the standby match.
Those last two matches were not the typical matches of Mid-South. The week after, Reed and Neidhart versus Tony Torres and George Weingroff. Nikolai versus Mike Jackson and Randy Barber. TA and 2 for the first time teaming up versus They weren't called the Devil's Duo, but Doug Vines and Jeff Sword.
Yeah.
Larry Higgins versus Art Cruz. Lanny Poffo versus John King. Crusher Darsow versus Paul Garner. And then 1 minute from Houston of Steve Williams defeating Bobby Duncombe. It's a really, really slow period. Even one of the weeks, Bill Watts goes silent during the matches. He has nothing to say.
But that's what was happening, is that he knew he needed a change. And as you mentioned, they prefaced things with the Road Warriors that ended up not happening, because I don't remember the Road Warriors coming back in 1984.
No, I don't remember them ever being back in 84.
And also, ICW had just closed up, the Poffos group. And Lanny got a spot down there, but that's when it was just an underneath spot. But that's when Jarrett had basically Angelo called on behalf of all of them. But they had a powwow with Jerry Jarrett, and he agreed to bring Savage in to do the angle with Lawler in Memphis that they'd been promoting on their show for 5 years. So now they got a chance to do it, just working for Jarrett. But there was talk that Lanny was trying to get Randy a spot in Mid-South. But as soon as Watts made the deal for Dundee to be the booker, then that would have been rendered immaterial. And I don't know which happened first here, but obviously Savage would not have come to Memphis if Dundee was still there, and Savage would not have come to Louisiana if Dundee was coming in to be the new booker. They would not have coexisted. So whether Lanny was trying to get Randy into Mid-South and then heard Dundee was going to be the new booker, and they gave up and started calling Jarrett because they knew they might be able to get in there now, or whatever. The point is, which came first, chicken or the egg? They weren't going to coexist, but that way it worked out for everyone. As soon as Dundee came in, a lot of those names that you read, and some of them were very nice people. George Weingroff was a wonderful kid, but they were gone. And he got up and down the card, whether it was, the Rock and Roll and Midnight on Top, or Buddy Landell or Terry Taylor, or whether it was, just even different and a little bit more exciting underneath talent that he brought in on to put in the preliminaries. So Dundee energized the Mid-South territory, and the fans were still, the lucky thing is the fans were still watching the TV. They hadn't given up on wrestling. It just that all of a sudden, the wrestling that they'd been enjoying for the last several years, just suddenly their favorites kind of left, and it got kind of in. But they were still watching the TV. So then you had them when new people came in that they could get interested to, and you shot angles, people were still watching it. So they didn't need to hot shot to get the people back to the buildings. They just needed to change talent and have a different booking philosophy and more action. And then they got the people back into the buildings, and then you could work the finishes in those house show matches that would draw for the returns. So you just talked about October and November. We did the first TVs in Thanksgiving, but we all started Christmas night. By the end of February, first part of March, we were starting to do record houses.
Couple things. One is the ICW guys used Mid-South as a way to get back into mainstream wrestling. One after another. Bob Roop, One Man Gang, eventually Lanny Poffo, George Weingroff, Rip Rogers, the Devil's Duo, although they didn't really do too much after that. But they all went to Mid-South after ICW because Bill Watts didn't really care about, he wasn't even an NWA member at that period of time.
Yeah, they hadn't run opposition to him. They all goddamn knew better than that to try anything like that again. They were splintered. They didn't have any ability. They were coming with hat in hand to get a job from Watts, rather than he would look at them like, well, would these guys possibly try to run opposition to me? He knew that was completely out of the question, and they did too.
And Bob Orton Jr. also, I should have added to that list.
Yeah, and, with Orton and Roop and some guys like that, it was, they were top talent, so it wasn't odd for him to use them. But then by the point that they had, pretty much folded up in 83, he took a lot of the guys because it was just different underneath talent. Doug Vines and Jeff Sword weren't a bad tag team, but you know, they were only going to go so far.
But if it hadn't worked out with Jerry Jarrett, which I have to think was kind of in a way Bill Watts' last resort, let me call Jerry Jarrett for help, because it appears he was doubling down on his relationship with Ole Anderson in the weeks and months before that. That's why the Road Warriors are there. That's why you had Georgia guys popping up with their belts on Mid-South Wrestling. Obviously,
well, and that's why he was using. Mike Jackson was the one who brought the job guys to Georgia for Ole, so he just brought them over to Louisiana for Watts. But I think he also saw that, well, you know, Ole's business was not setting the world on fire at that point in '83 as well. And, you know, when he came up, you could tell, obviously, he was sold on at least Dennis Condrey by that tease. But, you know, within a week after that TV show was taped, we already had plane tickets. And so he had made a quick, maybe that TV taping was what made him decide, you know what, I got to go get these guys I just saw in Memphis because this is the shits. And that may be what it was. Interesting.
Yeah, no, I saw that on the TV show and I was like, I don't have any memory of this, where Jim Ross flat out announced a few times next week the debut of Dennis Condrey on the show. So obviously,
and it also
things were happening on the fly.
Think about this. It also makes sense if Watts was working with Ole in Georgia, and then he goes up and he brings Dundee in, because Jarrett has said flat out, he said, well, you can have these guys and that guy and this guy and the talent, but the guy you need is a new booker, and he's sitting right there, pointed Dundee. And that's what turned the whole thing around. But can you imagine Dundee had just been to fucking Georgia, and back that summer they did a whole loser leave town angle with Dundee so he could go book Georgia at the behest of Jerry Jarrett as a favor to Ole. And fucking Ole pulled the plug on it after 6 weeks. So then Dundee had to float around in the Tennessee territory. He could only work spot shows because he'd lost a loser leave town match in every town in the territory. And it took 4 months for him to work him back into where it wouldn't, you know, just kill the stipulation, right? And they did record houses for those loser leaves with Lawler in every single fucking town. They did $40,000 in Lexington, sold out Louisville, sold out $46,000, 11,300 people in Memphis. So he goes, books Georgia for 6 weeks, get the plug pulled, comes back home to Nashville, has to work spot shows for 2 months. And then now he's going to be the new booker in Mid-South, and he's going to have to work with Ole and bring in. No wonder the Road Warriors didn't fucking come back for a year. He's probably like, fuck that, I'll bring my own guys in.